Our next speaker is Sharon Ardron. Sharon's a farm management specialist with Manitoba Agriculture. She has a strong financial and lending background that was garnered from working as an agricultural lender. She's worked across Western Canada and has had the pleasure working with and learning from a diverse portfolio of agriculture clients. Please join me in welcoming Sharon to Brandon Egg Days.
Thanks, Darren. Okay. So good morning, everyone. So I'm excited to see this many people here to hear this topic of doing your books, that it's not just about taxes. As a former lender, one of my marketing pitches that I used to use for prospecting was, what keeps you up at night? And I've changed this to say, what can you do to help yourself to be able to sleep at night? The trick, I think, with a lot of this stuff is you have to be able to sleep at night, realizing you can't control everything. But one key example of this is, so when I was lending, I had a customer who had a 6-figure operating line, and it was a year that was quite difficult to move grain because of transportation issues with the rail companies. And his wife stopped me one day in the street in the community in which we lived, and she said that, I'm going to send my husband in to talk to you. He can't sleep at night. He's been wrestling with this issue of cash flow. He doesn't know what to do. So I told her, by all means, have him come in, and we'll sit down and we'll talk and we'll see what we can figure out. So in the end, what we ended up doing is we did my standard inventory deck to see what was sitting in the bins and what he had for receivables, payables. And then what I did is I got him a temporary bulge, and I took him up to about, I think it was a mid 6-figure bump on his line. We put it in place for 2 months. The line stayed, it carried forth. He made some transactions, and in the end was still a little bit concerned about the repayment time frame. So I got him an extra extension for another 90 days. He paid it off within 35 days. And his wife said that after he came to see me and I had the approvals in place and we executed the documents, he had slept like he had never slept for quite a while because of the worry. So my tip is, if you can do something to make it so you can sleep at night, try to take that action. So how many of you have read the news daily? Pay attention to anything, and you see on there the headlines. It seems daily when President Trump takes to Twitter, there's something in the markets respond in either positive or negative aspects. The trade wars with China, the US, the Brexit discussions that are going on, crop prices seem to be testing new lows or trading in a lateral position. We're also seeing some softening demand for commodities. Drought conditions, the snow in September. There's many, many things in the media. The trick is that there's uncertainty and there's risk in the markets today, and this all has an impact on the pricing and our ability to compete with an ever-increasingly volatile marketplace. So it can be a bit unsettling. So the question is how, after you see these things, it's how resilient is your business to these changes? Realizing in some ways you can't control some of these variables, but other ways, are there some marketing opportunities in here that you can take advantage of to increase the revenue, which ultimately will increase your bottom line within the business? So the current business environment it's a changing dynamic. There's uncertainty, there's risk. We just can't control everything, but the goal is to try to control the variables within the business that you can and reduce exposure where you can. Exposure to risk where you can take advantage. Price volatility exists, and there will be trickle-down effects. Think of the example of China. Right now there's a lot of discussion about China in the media. We're kind of caught in a position between two of our biggest trading partners. Depending on the phrasing and the positioning of the Chinese Governments, will that have any impact on our access to markets within China? If it does, what kind of market access are we going to be facing? But the trick, ambiguity can be very difficult to work with, but the goal is to try to, with the financials coming back to the farm, the goal is to try to remove emotion from decision making, so you're using fact-based decisions on solid business fundamentals to try to figure out what the best track forward is for your particular farm. So I'm going to list off, I've got about 9 or 10 arguments about why the financials are important beyond just tax purposes. They're in no particular order, so I've just started numbering them just to get them down on paper and to just kind of bring these points back, and I want you to think about how these impact against your business, your bottom line. But my first question is, how many of you have either your year-end information done up to maybe December, or are all the way through to your fiscal year-end and your statements are ready to be handed off to the accountant? Okay. How many of you are on a 90-day reporting interval with your financial institution for your annual review? Okay. How many of you are on a 120-day interval? How many of you don't know what your interval is for your reporting? Okay, so that's okay. This opens up a perfect opportunity for you to call your lender and say, you know, we're looking at getting all the year-end data together. Can you just tell us, again, what our reporting deadlines are? Just so you know, so you can keep on the good side of that relationship. So I have here active management of expenses. I've got production, risk management, price, yield, equipment, land, interest rates. You've heard a lot of discussion today from Darren and Lance and Kevin about equipment costs, land costs, pricing, yield, there's risk. So any changes to any of these variables can have a direct impact on the income generated by the business to the farm, and this has a direct impact on your debt servicing capacity, on your working capital position. Some cases, some of the major changes to these can cause a change in your risk rating and your reporting on your financial with your lenders. So it's really important to, when you are going through your expense side of your equations, to be looking at some of these variables and seeing if you can trace any positive or negative impacts through the financials. If you see something that looks out of line or doesn't seem right, go back and see. Sometimes math errors do happen. I've made plenty of them. But just see if something is offline from prior years. If it's offline, go in and look. Maybe there's been some equipment changes. Maybe there's been some land changes. Maybe you're in an area that was hit with snow. There were several snowfalls this year that have had a big impact on the ability to get off that production, which in the end, that is going to bring down the net operating position in the cash position for those operations down. So these are things that you want to be looking at, because when your lender looks at those statements and puts them into their financial spreadsheets and spreads them, they're going to see some movement on your ratios. So if you can have when they ask and say what has happened, you can sit down and have a good discussion about the explanations. And I guarantee you, by having that good discussion with that explanation, you're making that credit easier to write for your lender, which if you make their job easy, it just works all together. So the next question is, again, to know your cost and expense structure. Knowing the neighbor's cost through Coffee Row doesn't really mean a lot. The trick is to know your cost of production for your farm at the starting point for profitability. If you don't know if you're making money, losing money, or sitting in a neutral position, it's very hard to know how to start doing some management of some of these expenses. Another great tip is to determine your cost per bushel sold, so you can build in an effective growth plan. It's good to have 1, 3, 5, 7, 10-year plans, realizing those plans can change. But if you don't have a roadmap of where you want to go with your business, if it's growth or sustainability, you can't get somewhere down the road without knowing the road. You may have to make a new road to the end destination, but you still need to have a plan. And each year is different. Profitability and risk are dependent on the relationship between yield, price, and costs with your financial situation. So, I mean, as we've seen this year, we had some major swings in yield, prices are changing, cost structures are changing. But in order to plan for prosperity, you need to know what your current situation is. And if you don't have your financials done, it's very hard to do this. So, I have an interesting story. This is the canola 20-year price chart. I just grabbed this off of barchart.com. But the story that I want to share with you is about having your financial statements current, and this can be quarterly, yearly, whichever increments you want to look at. If you know your expenses, you can find your break-even point. By then you can look into the market and you can see prices that are going to cover costs and hopefully at the end give you a level of profit. So I started my lending career up in the Peace Country of northern Alberta, about 5 hours north of Edmonton. And I had a client call me one day, and he said, "You're never going to believe what I've done." And I was like, "Try me. I'm not really a fan of surprises, but try me. Let's see what happens." So he had liquidated his cereals from harvest to this, I think was around November, December we had this discussion. So as you can see, I've put a big arrow beside the top of that chart. The market topped out around $17 a bushel. He hit about $16.75, $16.80, and he called me when this transaction was done. He happened to just be sitting on a right place, right time with the right inventory. He had piles of canola sitting in the bin, and he called and said, "I'm coming in to see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock. And I'm bringing 2 checks with me, and you're never going to believe what I've done." So he, in the end, told me he hit $16.50 or wherever that number fell. He came in and he brought those checks, and we looked at them and we discussed them. We had a great conversation about it and around it. And then I said, "Okay, what would you like to do?" And he said, "I need to pay down some of my larger loans." He wanted to take advantage of this opportunity. This was essentially found cash above and beyond his price structure. So what we did is we deposited the funds, we made some lump sum payments on some fixed rate loans for him, we did some floating pay downs, and he went away and said, "I'm never going to do this again. This is my once in a lifetime opportunity. I've essentially won the lotto and I've had a great time with it, but I am not banking on this ever again." It would be a fantastic story if our canola prices were like this and the whole commodity markets were lifted that high every year. But as we know, we saw within a few months after this rally went up, the market started to come down, and then we hit the subprime issue within the States that caused some financial distress around the country, around the world. So in this situation, you can't always bank on prices being that high. So don't be afraid to take profit out of the market. If you can get it, take it. So this has, I'm sure many of you, I'm sort of changing gears here pretty quickly, but how many of you have had a situation like this where you've had a great account manager, relationship manager with your financial institution, and all of a sudden they've made a move and you get someone who seems like they don't know what a cow is? Have any of you encountered that situation? Okay, well, I'll share my version of this. So in 2009, I moved from northern Alberta down into southeastern Saskatchewan, and I was coming into a community that I had no connection to. They did not know me. I was drifting in from out of province. They probably were wondering who I was. So when I came waltzing into the community, I was replacing someone who had spent their entire working career within that community. They raised their family there. Their extended family lived in that area. And they also were now retiring within the community. So if we remember what January, February of 2009 was like, the markets were very, very fractious at the time. There was a lot of uncertainty, a lot of unknown. And at that time, I'm coming into a new portfolio. I'm trying to build new relationships with this client base that I'm going to be responsible for. And the directive came down that we were going to be repricing operating lines. The other trick is that I was about the age of their children, and their children had moved away, were working in healthcare, oil and gas, any other sector except agriculture. So I really had to work hard to prove myself. I was also starting probably 50 feet back from day one because I was going to be entering into some very difficult conversations on let's reprice your operating. If you want to start a conversation really quickly that will go potentially bad, this is it. But I got very lucky. I worked really hard that first year to prove myself to clients, and they were open and probably a little skeptical, but in the end, I won them over. And I also had a great handoff from the old account managers, so that those factors all worked together, and a little bit of luck, and I had a great time. And we had some great working relationships, and I got really lucky. And some of those working relationships became some great friendships that I still treasure to this day. But also, in having to prove myself, I had to be curious because I had to overcome this huge amount of skepticism. And once I got there, we were able to do some pretty great things. So, my next point of having your statements and being able to use them beyond just getting the taxes done and throwing them on the banker's desk and say, there you go, we'll see you next year. These can be a foundational tool that can prove to form an effective relationship with your lender. They become the mechanism to sit down and talk about the good, talk about the bad, talk about the plan. The plan can change, but if you bring them into the loop, it helps them to know what you're doing, know what you're thinking. How many of you know what your financial covenants are on your operating, around your whole credit facility relationship? You know what your debt service coverage is? Do you know what your borrowing base test may be on your operating line? More importantly, do you know how to calculate those ratios with your lender? If you don't, ask them to show you the calculation so that you can do that calculation and test it. Also here, ask lots and lots of questions, and don't be afraid to call them and ask them questions. I remember talking through several deals with some clients about potentially buying land or buying some equipment. And in some cases, we talked through that deal, and I may have had a chance at getting that deal, I may not have. The odd time I actually just did have to say, you know, it would be great if I could get that onto my book of business, but that really is the better deal, and you should take advantage of it. And by saying, yes, go, you know, as much as I wanted the business, that is a great deal, take advantage of it, knowing that's gonna help me deepen that relationship with the client, because the next time they're gonna give me potentially a crack at another purchase that they're looking at. And how many of you have been caught by maybe snow or unable to combine some of the fields from this harvest we just came through? Okay, so don't be afraid to call your lender and say, this is the scenario we're up against. It may become something, it may not become something, but what you want to do is just give them the heads up. It's much easier for them to put a potential solution in place to your potential challenge early if they can see the storm clouds are coming, rather than after the fact and trying to figure out a solution where there may not be one. One example I ran into in 2010, I was living in southeastern Saskatchewan. That fall, we ended up probably around 40 inches of rain. But at the start of the season, We got off to a really good start. Moisture levels were good. The sun was shining. Everybody got the air drills out and went. And about May long, the rain clouds started to come, and they kept coming and coming and coming. And of this group of clients I was working with, several were really concerned they were going to rip their drills apart or cause irreparable damage to those units. And as we started to go forward past May long, they were getting really, really concerned they weren't going to be able to seed. So in the end, some made some changes. They were trying Valmars, they were trying drawbars with them, trying anything to get as much of that crop in the ground as they could. But I had one client call me up and he said that he had gotten a lead on a high-speed disc that he was going after because he needed to get something on that soil to fluff it up, but he tried with the cultivator and was sinking way down, so he was causing more damage that way. So he phoned me up, and typically clients didn't call me in the evening, but this one was an exception on an exception. He called and said, "I've found the unit. I'm going first thing tomorrow morning. I need to draw down on that reserve loan you had set aside for me." So typically with the clients I had, they were a strong group, so I typically had $100,000, $200,000 reserve loan sitting there that if something came up and they needed to move quickly, we had that flexibility. Some drew down, some never did. But in this case, he called me and I said, "Kate, great, I'll order the package in the morning." So I talked to my credit documentation person. She got them drafted. She sent them to me by fax. And I told the client, when you get to the destination, tell the dealer to fax me the paperwork so I can get the serial numbers and everything filled in on the security document. And when he got home, I met him the next morning. He was hooking onto the tractor. And I met him in the yard, and we executed the documents, and I was able to get it funded out within about 24 hours so that he bought it, and we had it so that it was one less thing that he had to worry about in that year when there were a lot of struggles and challenges that people were worrying about. And the rest of that client base, at the end of the year when I was doing those annual reviews, everyone surprisingly debt serviced and had no major issues meeting their targets that they had to do with the bank, which was a great feeling. So this is just a chart that I was looking through some Statistics Canada information, and I thought it would be interesting to go back to about 2008, which was roughly when I started lending, to come forward to 2017, just to get an idea of what the growth curve of the Canadian farm debt is doing. And then I was also curious, because I'm a former banker, I'm always curious about how that level of debt is split amongst the players in the market. And you can see here the growth curve that has occurred over time, but you can also see the spread of that debt across the players in the market. And this is nothing more than just an interesting look at the growth that has happened within the debt within Canada, and that the players have stayed pretty stable within that market. And then this is the Manitoba comparison, just to see the top line is the total debt level, and then below these are just the different players within the market. So there's debt there. Debt is sometimes a way that you finance growth in the business, and it works. It's just to be prudent and be on top of that debt. Okay, and so by having those financial statements done and knowing how to read the financial statements and reading the notes within that financial statement, and also looking at your security documents you sign with the lender when you're advancing on new debt, you begin to get a really good idea of where your farm levels are sitting, and this can help you decide where you're going. But it's also important to know how the current and long-term debts are structured, and to know what security supports what debt. So how many of you, if I asked you about the whole debt portfolio that you hold, if you hold any, do you know how that security is shared and what facilities it supports, or if there's any specific facility type structuring in there? Okay. This can be another conversation to have with your lender. It's good to know these questions. Another question I have is, how many of you have credit insurance coverage on on your loans, whether it's all of them, some of them, part of them. Okay, I have a story about this. That it was a client that I had dealt with, but her husband, they farmed as a partnership, but he mainly handled all of the finances. So he was handling the debts, the setting up new facilities, but he told, I mean, she knew where the debts were, she knew dollar values, but she didn't know everything in great detail. And he was a believer. He had probably way too much insurance coverage, but this was just the way he was taking care of his family. And he passed away unexpectedly. And after some time, his wife had come in to see me because she'd found some credit insurance paperwork within the loan documents within their files, and she wanted to come in and talk about it and learn more about this. So we discussed it, and she brought the death certificate and all the other information that I needed, and I printed off the paperwork for her, and she took it to her family doctor, and it was completed as it had to be done. And we sent the package away, and a few weeks later, she came back, and everything had been approved, and we were discussing what to do next. And she had about 6 figures of coverage. There was significant coverage. So we got all the debts paid down, got everything cleared up, and she still had a significant amount of money left, and she didn't know what to do with it, and she had some health concerns of her own. So I said, how about I have access to a wealth professional. Would you like to talk to him? And she thought that would be a good idea. So we went through and got that discussion set up. And in the end, she was able to use those proceeds from her husband's passing and all of that, a terrible time. But she was able to then set up a plan for her kids going forward so that they were able to ease into farming and know that if something happened, they had a bit of a nest egg taken care of, that their dad was helping, reaching out into the future and helping them. And so for new debt considerations, we're getting into a period where maybe, I don't know, my hunch is that it's getting a little tight out on the horizon, but that's only my hunch. But for new debts, I think it's important to look at how this asset you're looking at potentially bringing on board is going to increase the bottom line position, as well as what is potentially being put at risk. We've built equity, but if you add more land, you're increasing risk. You're increasing the obligations of the business to generate the revenue needed to meet those debt obligations. Risk tolerance is going to have an impact on this decision. Everyone has a different risk appetite. Some people are indifferent to it. Others just can't handle. They're in a risk-averse state. They don't like risk. Other people the more risk they can take, the better, because the outcome is worth it to them. So this will change your thoughts, but by having current financial statements, you can stress test those numbers. You can play with the numbers on paper and see by adding if you're looking at a piece of equipment, you can bump your asset value, you can change your cash position for down payment, and then you can layer the debt load into the current scenario to see what does that look like. Just help you to decide, does this make sense? What does it look like for the farm? And then run a scenario where you bring revenues down by maybe 30-40% just to see what it looks like if you were to have something like a challenging harvest or challenging seeding, a hailstorm, whatever the factor is. It's just a way to test these numbers. Okay, so this is the total liabilities in Canada versus the prairie provinces in 2008 to 2017. You look at the curve, it's got a good upslope. It's not a steep spike, but we've increased our debt load quite a bit. So this means there are more farms that are going to have more debt on the financial statement. And it's easy to make those debt payments when revenues are high because of high yields, high prices, but what does it look like if you play around with yield and take yield down or take price down? What does that impact on your bottom line look like? And how resilient is your business to having a change like that? And the one major thing out of this curve is that we as a country overall, our ability to compete could be impacted by this because we become a bit of a more expensive player in the international market because we need to have a slightly higher price to cover these higher debt obligations. So this is another one, a key one out of your financial statements. Many of the accounting software programs out there generate different kinds of reports. Take a look at the report. Know what your ratios look like. If you're not sure how to interpret them, find someone. It can be going through your network of people to find somebody who is an expert who can take a look at your numbers and help you to understand what that means. But if you're going to go down that path, be sure to be engaged and ask lots of questions about them to help you so you can understand and improve your knowledge and your language of financial fluency. In the financial statements, all production, operating, and financing decisions are going to be seen. I know when I was lending, I used to look at working capital, debt service, and leverage to see sort of, once I had spread the financial statement, to see what's going on, because often credit is a bit of an art, but it's also science, and it's also based on gut and validating your gut response with the data. So often if there were issues within maybe debt service, I could often figure out, going back through or asking the client some pretty targeted questions, I was able to figure out what was going on. In one financial statement I looked at, they were offside on their debt service by quite a bit. I ended up asking them about some transactions, and they went back and asked their accountant, and they were able to tell me pretty easily what the issue was. And by having that information, I was able to explain to my credit department what was going on, and we were just able to sort of smooth the annual review process out. Ratio analysis is going to show what the trend lines are like for your operation. The direction of the trend line is important. You want to see a nice either level, or you want to see at least the curve going up. But it's knowing what does that curve look like for your farm in a current year, and also going back and looking into the last 3 to 5 years to help validate that current year of information. And context is an essential consideration when you're interpreting ratios. You need to look at what's going on in the industry, in growing conditions in your area, and also it can be larger regional or national issues. I had the pleasure of working with one farm in particular that was very strong. They were very, very up on their financials. They could go into their system at any point and tell me roughly what their numbers were. And part of the annual review discussion is we sat down and talked about what had happened, their execution against their goals. And we were often able to sit down and look at the calculations of the ratios, and often we were within about 15 to 20% of each other, just because of some differences in how the calculations were done. But they knew their numbers, and I was able to learn a lot from them in just having to be at the top of my game in order to have the level of conversation that was needed to keep up with them. So another component is to conduct, I'm a big fan of conducting financial stress tests, or what if analysis is often another name that is used within this. How many of you use this, take your financial data from your notice to reader statement or your tax return or whatever your form of data is, and we'll do some stress testing on it to see what some potential changes could be to your farm if you're looking at adding new debt or making some changes to some production. Maybe you're picking up some rental acres. So I used to do this when I was lending. I had a very strong client base, but I did this just as a way to check my gut, and to also, because my manager of Ed Credit at the time was a big fan of this. So when I was lending with the bank, it was a very, very conservative form of lending. So I often had to prove my arguments quite well. So if my clients came in and said they wanted to do something in particular, I would create the scenario, run it, and then I would take their price and I might drop it by 50%, because I wanted to see that if the price fell for whatever reason in the market, or yields or whatever it was, could they at least cover the payment? And more often than not, it took more work for me to find that bottom than was probably worth it, but at least I had the knowledge in knowing they're strong enough to handle this, and it makes sense. So it's an opportunity. This is an opportunity for you to sit down and play with scenarios, test them. You can try this idea, you can run the idea on paper and see what it looks like. And it doesn't hurt to run a good, average, and ugly scenario. Average is probably going to be your conservative base. So if you are looking at maybe equipment financing to allow for a coverage of, increased rental acres or whatever that scenario may be, this will allow you to sort of get the base case and then be optimistic. Run where you're getting 15 to 20, 30% more yield than you think you could get, but also go the other way and take your yields down or take your price down. Just do something to bring that bottom number, that net income number, just bring it down and see what does that impact look like on the financials, and trace them through and just see what it looks like. It doesn't mean that running the optimistic and the pessimistic attitudes or scenarios are going to become reality. It's just a way to test those numbers and to test the resilience of your business. Just what if something happens? Can you handle this resilience? It's a way, by having these current statements and doing some stress testing on the numbers, it's a way to see how strong the farm is at withstanding some changes to some potential storms that could come up. It could be price, it could be interest rate, it could be yields. So risk management strategies. How many of you have a risk management plan? Insurance, marketing plan, crop insurance, agri-stability, any of those sorts of things. Production insurance, as we've heard from Kevin, there is crop insurance, there's revenue insurance options available out on the market. Don't be afraid to explore them. They may be the right solution or they may not be the right solution, but at least investigate to make a sound decision of, does this fit my operation, yes or no? How many of you participate in agri-stability, agri-invest, more of a just in case? Okay, the program has gone through changes, as we've heard from Kevin, but it's one mechanism. It's a cheap form of insurance, if nothing else. It gives you a bit of a basic level of coverage. How many of you do self-insurance? I haven't seen this one. This is not a common one that I've run into, but I have seen a couple of examples of it. This would be parking a set amount of funds aside in a separate account from outside of the main operating account, that if something happens, an unexpected, the tractor blows an engine and you need to repair it, there's your funds. Or revenue, or whatever the case may be. It's not a common, I never ran into it often, but ran into a couple of scenarios with it. The goal is to look for some potential risk. Is there potential risk within your financial statement? Is there anything you can do to offset that risk? Production, margin insurance, whatever that mechanism may be. But also things like having a current will, also having active power of attorney. It can also be things like production insurance. It can be things like fixed interest rates. I dealt with a producer who had lived through the period of the high interest rates, And when the market started to get moving really funny in 2009 there, he did not like that exposure to that uncertainty. So what we did is he had some larger loans that were floating, and we submitted to get an approval to be able to split, to change some of the rates to go from a floating rate to a fixed. And the rates kept dropping down, but he just couldn't handle that upside risk that the rates could turn and start going up. He just, given his past experience and his risk tolerance, we did this, and this just helped him to be able to sleep at night. And also he felt protected, that his business was protected in case rates went crazy. So there's risk everywhere. Just try to mitigate the risk as much as you can. Oh, yes. How many of you have been following the news over the last year and have seen the active announcements that the Bank of Canada has made about the target, the overnight rate? How many of you have thought about what does this mean for that interest expense line code on the income statement, and what does that mean for your operation? Granted, rates right now are low. We're seeing in the last year we've had a 75 BIP increase to the overnight rate, which then pushes prime up and pushes up your fixed and floating rates. If you're in a fixed rate, you are protected from this upside movement. If you're in a variable rate loan, you will see, if you look out at your main operating account where your loan payments are processed through, you will see the principal amount may stay the same, but you're seeing some uptick on that interest rate dollar value. Depending on what you think is going to happen and what I think is going to happen about the future, completely out there, who knows what's going to happen, but it can be what happens if rates go up 2%, what if rates go up 5%, what does that look like to your scenario with your particular debts? And it can be, there's lots of online tools that you can use for loan calculators that you can go in and, put roughly what the loan balance is and the interest rate, or just take your rate and add 4% and see what it looks like, and then, trace that through into the income and expense line and see what that does to the bottom line. And the good financial records help to track growth, and it also helps to ensure you're making strong management decisions that are based on current, accurate information. There's nothing worse than looking at information that's maybe 1 or 2 years old, and you want to make a deal, and the deal is there, and it's a really good deal, but it's to decide if you want to complete that transaction. And there's nothing worse than losing out on a deal, really good deal, because you've had to go through and get the financial statements done really quickly so that you can give them to the lenders so that they can do a quick assessment to ultimately decide yes or no on an approval for you. By having solid financial data, you are able to review annual changes in your balance sheet and your personal net worth statement. If you've set performance goals, this can help you to decide, are you performing to those goals, or do you need to make some adjustments in a plan? Again, what is that target? It could be expansion, retirement, succession planning, sustainability. The goal will vary with the operation, and every operation will have different goals. Every business owner can have different goals within the same business. But this is just going to give you a really solid set of financial information to work from. I'm sure we've all heard the acronym garbage in, garbage out. If you have poor quality data to work with at the start, you're going to have poor quality data to be able to use to make decisions. So the goal is to have the best financial information you can at the start so that you're generating solid, strong information, strong statements that you can use for making the best decision you can at the time. How many of you use benchmarking as a way to evaluate your position and your farm against kind of the pack to see how you're doing against the group? All right. This can be another way to test the resiliency of your business, but in order to participate in benchmarking, you need to have good financial information available so that you can see how your business is performing. It can be against yourself on a year-over-year basis, or it can be against a similar group of producers. And those producers could be in a particular location, it could be in a region, or it could be across country. It's a tool to help shape and guide decision-making processes, and it can help identify areas that are underperforming or are showing signs of weakness, and it can help you to put in place some proactive steps to help improve those areas. All right, so that's everything that I have to say. Here is my contact information if you have any questions, or if you want to ask me anything more about what we've covered. Are there any questions? All right, well, thank you for your time this morning, and enjoy the rest of the show.